of ideas forums to explore really important cultural issues in serious, intelligent, accessible, engaging, interdisciplinary ways, with a particular focus on the concerns of Jeffrey Rubinoff, who created this sculpture park and all the sculptures within it. And I think we've been going now, did we think about 16 years or so? And in that time, we have tackled so many big topics, art and war, art and crisis, art and moral conscience. Last year, we had an incredible event on art and music. But this year, we're focusing on an issue that's urgently relevant, one that's rapidly evolving around us as we speak, and one that's moving so quickly that it will probably have changed unrecognizably by the time we finish this conversation tomorrow afternoon. So we are, of course, discussing that complex and in many ways already controversial relationship between art and AI and artificial intelligence. I just want to begin, I'm only going to talk for a few minutes, but I just want to begin by painting a slightly broader picture and saying that, of course, art and technology, as Kate knows better than almost anyone, art and technology have always been connected. Even the very word technology, it comes from the word techne or techni, which was used by the ancient Greeks to describe, among other things, art. And I'm an art historian, and if you go back through history, through the centuries, what you'll find is that artists have always embraced new technologies. In prehistoric times, they harnessed fire to make the very earliest pigments. In the Renaissance, they invented perspective. In later years, they used lenses and microscopes and camera obscuras. In the 20th century, they embraced early plastics and electrical equipment and broadcast to make works that were as cutting edge as any of the technologies of the time. But I think that never in history has technology, maybe people will disagree, but never has technology come quicker and come faster than it has done over the last few decades, primarily due to computerization and digitization. And I think these changes are so profound that many people think of them as amounting to a third or a fourth industrial revolution, depending on how you count them. The first one being the invention of steam power, the second one being the invention of electricity. And we all know, I think, from our personal experience, how fundamentally these new technologies are transforming everyday life. The way we shop, the way we work, the way we communicate and socialize, the way that states function, the way they wage war. And of course, they'd also have an enormous impact on our culture and visual culture as well. And I really do think that over the last few decades, really actually over the last few years, we've seen this absolute explosion. We will hear a lot about this over the next couple of days, an explosion of these new visual platforms. There is, of course, virtual reality, and we trialed a virtual reality piece, didn't we, Karun, last year, where we took one of the great, actually my favorite Rubinoff, a great Series 4 piece up that we discussed yesterday, and you could experience it through the headset. But there's also some mixed and augmented realities. There's 3D printing, there's robotics, there are NFTs, and there's this kind of epidemic of, epidemic's probably the wrong word to use, but these experiential, immersive art installations, the Van Gogh experience, the David Hockney experience that are sort of appearing in event spaces all over our cities. And I do think that all of these new platforms, they are changing the way that art is made, they're changing the way it's displayed, they're changing the way it's experienced, the way it's bought and it's sold, in really interesting ways. But it seems to me that the most profound alteration to existing understandings of art is coming through AI, because I think for many people, not for everyone, but for many people, AI appears to be challenging the very notion of creativity, the very notion of the artist. Now, I said earlier that we always try to connect these forums to the concerns of Jeffrey Rubinoff. And although he died in 2017, was it, Betty? So before the latest surge of AI, although AI has been going on for decades in different iterations, of course, I think his work and his insights are sort of profoundly relevant to what we're discussing over the next few days. And the first thing to say, and this is something that Karun brought out in his absolutely sensational tour yesterday, is that Jeffrey really was a great embracer of technology. His is an art of corten and stainless steel. It's of welding and angle grinding. And of course, as Karun said, it's about an art of computers, because Jeffrey was using digital design software, the AutoCAD software, to design his works, I think from as early as the mid-1990s. I mean, it goes back a long way, his use of computers. But though his tools, his techniques, his materials were very modern. In some ways, Geoffrey's philosophy and ethos of art was quite a traditional, almost romantic philosophy of art, because I think his understanding of art was rooted in the idea of the artist as part of a unique and valuable group of human people who were born rather than made, in his view, who possessed profound insights about the world, who had unbendable moral consciences. And an artist was someone who was not only an embodiment of existence, but a kind of, he said it himself, a witness to existence itself. And I think Geoffrey viewed the artist as in some ways, the most human of all humans, and art as the most human of all activities. And as some of you will know from the workshop we did yesterday, Geoffrey was very fond of maxims. He's a master of the maxim. And if you just think of three of them, you probably saw them on the sheets we did yesterday, but three of particularly relevant ones. Art is an act of will in accord with a mature conscience. Art is the map of the human soul. Art is existential to the artist. And if you think of the key words there, conscience, soul, existential, those are quite relevant. And I think the question for me is how the development of AI, a cultural generator, if you like, without a conscience, without a soul, you might think, how does it complicate that philosophy and that ethos? And as I said before, Geoffrey never saw the recent surge in AI, but I know even back then he had strong views on it. And I wonder, I'd like to know what sort of Betty and Karun and Charo and Alan might have thought of this, but I wonder whether if he'd witnessed what is happening now, I think he'd have taken one of two positions. I think he'd have either seen AI as an existential threat to the future of art and the future of humanity, or he would have seen it as inherently incapable of producing real art and therefore worthless. And I'm not quite sure what position he would have taken. So over the next few days, we're going to explore these and some other perspectives on the artistic implications of art. And they raise so many fascinating questions. And here are just some of the questions I think are kind of worth teasing out. And one is, this question of whether AI undermines creativity. Does it threaten artists just as automation threatens other human occupations? Or, as I think Anthony's going to discuss, is it better to think about AI not as an artist in a way, but as a tool or a platform or a medium or a collaborator, which might embolden artists perhaps or multiply creative opportunities? Will AI lead us into uncharted cultural terrain? Will it sort of produce an unprecedented era of innovation? Or is algorithmic, if you like, image generation inherently incapable of producing original art because it's ultimately grounded in databases of pre-existing content? Can AI-generated culture be intellectually or politically revolutionary? Or will a platform controlled by tech companies, ultimately, that's sort of, driven, based in data harvesting, will that always skew towards the status quo, and particularly the capitalist status quo? And finally, might we think, and I think this is something that will come out of our discussion of Aidan tomorrow, might we think of our AI not as so much as an artist or a tool or as a collaborator, but as a kind of metaphor, as a subject that is urgently important, and one that sheds light on a world in which machines and humans, between the physical and the virtual, the offline and the online, are becoming increasingly blurred. And so these are all very complicated questions, and I can't wait to hear our speakers and our delegates respond to them. But before we get going, I've basically finished now. Amazingly, we're ahead of schedule. Won't last long. Before we get going, just a few logistical remarks. The first thing is, hopefully you've all got an agenda here. You'll see that we've got 2 days of events. We're having papers by established academics and practitioners in the morning, separated, of course, by the mandatory coffee break. Don't worry, there will be coffee breaks. And after lunch, we'll hear from a succession of brilliant students. We'll have a few today and a few tomorrow from UVic and from UBC, who are also going to reflect in their own way on the theme of the forum. And I want to reiterate what I always say at the beginning of these events, and I think Karun mentioned it yesterday. We call these company of ideas forums for 2 reasons. First of all, they're about the free exchange of ideas. And second, they're about the pleasure of company and companionship. We want these events to be enjoyable, inclusive, kind spaces where we don't really have hierarchies between professors and students or academics and non-academics, and where everyone's voices are welcome. And I think this is a subject where that is more relevant than ever before, because, ultimately, in the end, this year's topic is happening to every single one of us right now. We all have skin in the game. We all have views of relevance. And you'll see I've put much more time in the schedule, much more slack in the schedule this year than normally, to make sure that everyone gets an opportunity to ask questions of our speakers. I know all of the speakers want to have detailed conversations and in-depth conversations about these topics. So please do get engaged and enjoy yourself, and don't feel that you're ever going to say anything. Nothing stupid could ever be said in this space. So please get stuck in. Okay, let's get started. We have, I think, 13 speakers to hear from over the next 2 days. So let me introduce, without further ado, our first speaker. Anthony Cross is Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Texas State University. His work and his teaching is extremely wide-ranging, but he has focused quite a lot of late on the relationship between aesthetics and technology, and has written brilliantly about the relationship between art and the internet, new media, NFTs, and of course AI. And I've got to say, Anthony, I'm particularly grateful for you coming here, because this is one of the busiest weeks of the year for Anthony and his family. And in order to make it to the forum, he's undertaking this kind of Odyssean journey where he's got to leave early on a speedboat, I think, or on a ferry, or he's driving back this enormous vehicle back over the island tomorrow afternoon early. Then he's flying not home to Texas, but to Denver, and then renting another car, which he's driving with his 2 children in the back of the car all the way to Nebraska to go to another event. All of this. So we're tremendously grateful for you squeezing us in.
Well, thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. I am very grateful to the Rubinoff Sculpture, part of the Company of Ideas Forum, to be here. And I'm very excited to talk about what I think is a really interesting set of issues with all of you. So I'm looking forward to the conversations that we have. And so I will be talking today, as I think came out a bit in the introduction, about some of the ways that AI might scaffold or integrate into an artistic process. I'm going to be less concerned with questions of whether, let's say, AI might be itself genuinely creative. I'll be focusing instead on the ways that artists might make use of it and how that use might be significant for them. But I'm going to start with a rather controversial case, which you may or may not be familiar with. So I'll talk a little bit about this, and then we can sort of go from there. This is an AI-generated image by the amateur artist Jason Allen, titled Teatro d'Opera Spatiale, a rather pretentious title, which he generated using the AI image generator Midjourney in 2022. He was very excited about this image, so excited that he submitted it to the Colorado State Fair's Amateur Digital Arts Competition, which he won. He won a grand prize of $300, beating out the other 20 submissions to the category. This in itself is not that notable, except for the fact that he then went on to brag about his victory in various online forums. And this actually went viral. Lots of folks began to kind of pile on with actually widespread condemnation of this development. Some dismissed his work entirely, suggesting that it, along with most other AI-generated images, were just simply not art at all, which I don't think is, particularly fair. There's a long history of artists making use of various pieces of technology or tools or generators. I mean, in fact, if Marcel Duchamp can take a urinal in 1920 and submit it to an art competition, then I think and that then would go on to become one of the most celebrated works of the 20th century. I think there should be no problem with thinking that this is genuinely art. So I'm not going to address the is this art question. I'll just take that as a given. But I think a more common complaint was that Allen's submission was somehow deceptive. That the judges of the competition, they were in fact unaware of the fact that Allen had made use of Midjourney, which is an AI image generation platform, to create the work, even though he did sign it. He said that in submitting the piece, he submitted it with the label Jason M. Allen via Midjourney as the artist name. So he did include some clues, and he never claimed that he had created the piece entirely on his own. He broke no rules, and the judges actually said afterwards that had they known it was generated using AI, they probably still would have given it the award. But even so, there is a kind of concern that maybe there was a kind of misrepresentation of achievement here, that it wasn't clear what Jason Allen himself had done and whether, in some sense, the credit was not entirely due to him, but rather should be attributed to the AI image generation platform, to Midjourney itself. And it seems like this is part of what is motivating a great deal of the outrage, the sense that Allen, in some sense, was not responsible for creating this and therefore does not deserve the credit or praise. And that is an interesting question in its own right, but I think that there's kind of a deeper question here, which it is the case that Allen did something in making use of this tool. Whether or not it's the same kind of achievement as what it would have been had he generated this image on its own is not really the sort of thing that I want to focus on. Rather, I'm kind of curious about what exactly he did. What was kind of the agency or the action that took place when he generated this image, and why might that be significant? And what I'm going to be interested in this talk, what I'll be focusing on, are going to be questions about the agency of the artist in making use of AI tools like Midjourney, DALL-E, other image generation platforms. What exactly is it that artists are doing, and how should we conceptualize it? And so this is a kind of more basic question, but it's one that I think that in answering it, hopefully we will begin to make some progress on some of the downstream questions. For example, questions about appreciation of AI art, questions about credit, about praise, all of those sorts of things I think depend upon a richer understanding of what exactly it is that AI artists are doing. And so that's what I'll be focusing on, but I'm gonna start with a very, very brief technical primer. I promise I will try to keep it as straightforward as possible. I know that we are coming to this with very different levels of familiarity with AI platforms, and so I will try to pitch this at the most accessible level. For many of you, this might be kind of old hat. But what I will be focusing on primarily will be AI image generation tools. And there are obviously now AI music generation tools, AI video generation tools, many other sorts of platforms. I'm going to be limiting my attention only to those tools that yield an output of an image. But I think a lot of what I have to say will apply more generally to other forms of generative AI. And so at the most basic level, how exactly do these tools work? If you have played around with any of these, you probably know that the current crop of these tools start with a text prompt. You enter a piece of text in which you describe whatever image it is that you would hope to generate, and then the platform will generate said image. And this is often an iterative process. You might begin with a very vague prompt, and then as you get the results back, you begin to refine it, and the process of refining your prompt can perhaps get you to the kind of image that you're looking for. By his own account, Jason Allen spent hours developing and refining the prompt that he used to generate the image that I showed you, a prompt that he has, to this point, not shared with the public. He considers that to be central to his work. So then, how exactly does this work? The result, the generation of the image, is the result of the application of what are called transformer-based architectures that allow tools to interpret and encode textual input in a representational space known as latent space, which can then be mapped into image components. So basically, your text is transformed into an algorithmic representation, which is then sort of decomposed and recoded into a latent space, a sort of algorithmic model of it. And then, through very complicated means, the sort of latent space representation is decoded into an image by way of a variety of different models for image generation. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. But I think the really salient point, and this will be important for my argument later, is that the effectiveness of these tools is the result of their having been trained on massive data sets of image-text pairs. And the current crop of tools have been trained in particular on image-text pairs that are scraped from the internet. Just, for example, DALL-E, which is one of the most prevalent, most popular image generators, relies on OpenAI's CLIP model, which is their contrastive language image pre-training model. And this is a model that has scraped hundreds of millions of images from the internet, looked at the alt text, the sort of text description that is paired with the image, and then sort of used that to generate a latent space model of image text pairs. Basically, that is the way that these data sets are, these algorithms are able to recognize what it is that you are looking for in your text input is by kind of comparing it with the way that it has been trained on these massive data sets. So I won't go into any more detail. Feel free to correct me if I've misrepresented any of this, but this is kind of the basic idea. And so you may be familiar having played around with this. Here's an example. This is DALL-E 3, variations on the prompt, Friedrich Nietzsche eating an ice cream cone in the style of Van Gogh. As you'll notice, it's a bit odd. It looks, I think, less like Nietzsche and a bit more like Van Gogh. He has a goatee in all of these instead of a mustache. It's very strange. But I mean, you kind of, if you have played around with AI image generation, this should all be familiar. These are all sort of variations. And then presumably one could also refine this. You could sort of pick one and make alterations and go further. But this is kind of the output. And so this is the characteristic experience of using one of these tools. And so I'm going to be quite concerned with, just to get a little bit more concrete here, the following question about this process. What role does the human artist play in creating AI-generated art? What does their agency consist in, and how might it matter? And some other questions that I hope will come up in the process is, what is the role that generative AI plays in this process? How does it contribute to AI-generated art? What constitutes artistic achievement in AI art making? And what is the status of the AI artwork itself? And how is it related to the agency of the human artist? It should be hopefully no surprise that there's not a single answer, I think, to any of these questions, because as I think we'll see in a lot of the presentations later in the forum, artists make use of generative AI to make art in a very wide variety of ways. Artists are doing a lot of very interesting things with generative AI. But I do think that there are kind of characteristic patterns of agency, of ways that artists are making use of AI platforms. And by kind of mapping these out, I think that we can get at least a couple of templates for thinking about how artists might make use of AI that can then help us to better understand and appreciate it going forward. So what I'm going to do is present two of these patterns. I'll call them, and this is perhaps confusing because people also talk about models in sort of AI models all the time, so maybe we should come up with better terminology. But I'll be talking about what I call the production model and the exploration model. And both of these represent different ways of relating to generative AI and incorporating it into an artistic practice. And I'll explain each of these, and then I'll talk about their significance for the understanding and appreciation of AI art. So I'll start with the production model. And I think that this is kind of the default understanding of the way that we make use of generative AI tools. According to the production model, human artists make use of generative AI as either a tool or kind of collaborator in the generation of an artistic product. And AI is going to play a kind of role. It's going to be subservient to the intentions of the human artist. But ultimately, the role that AI is going to play is as it's going to, in some way, assist in the creation of an output. And it is the output of this process, the production itself, that is the site of artistic appreciation. That is what we ought to be paying attention to. The image, the film, the piece of music, whatever it is that comes out of the process, that is what we ought to be looking at, and that's what constitutes the creative achievement on the part of the AI artist. And like I said, I think this is kind of the default understanding. And I think part of why this is the default understanding of AI-generated art is that it's a very easy model to motivate by way of appeal to analogy with other existing art forms. So one oft invoked analogy is that AI art is a kind of tool. And there is a long history of artists making use of technology, as James mentioned, of making use of tools in particular to generate images. So, one example would be photography. This is an image of Walker Evans on the sidewalk using a view camera. Think about, in this case, a photographer makes use of the tool, the camera, to create an image. It seems like AI-generated art, we could adopt very much the same model. Think about a musician. Here's Suzanne Ciani using an early modular synthesizer. A musician might make use of a piece of technology as a tool to create a particular kind of sound, to create a particular kind of music. And so this is sort of one way of thinking of AI's role. Another way of thinking of it is as a kind of collaborator. So, think about other examples of artists who have relied on collaborators. There's a long history of artists who have made use of studio assistants. From painters from the Renaissance onwards have often employed assistants to help in the realization of their artworks, often delegating more mundane tasks like painting backgrounds or repetitive details. But some artists like Jeff Koons here rely more heavily on their studio assistants. Koons basically has his assistants. This is an image of him at the bottom. He's not the shark. That's Damien Hirst that does the shark stuff. No, this is Jeff Koons. He relies almost entirely on his studio assistants to realize his artworks, and he thinks of himself as just kind of the idea person who has sort of ultimate veto power. And so in these sorts of cases, artists have traditionally relied on collaborators. Think also about film production. This is a still from the production of Jaws, where directors will often rely very heavily on their collaborators to realize films. And so AI is often compared to a kind of artistic collaborator that we rely on to, again, generate an output. But what is common to both of these examples, before we get there, I do want to note that there are problems with each of these analogies. Obviously there are concerns about whether AI can actually be, it is in fact an artistic tool. A worry in particular is that there's a kind of opacity to making use of AI. So when you are using a tool like a camera, let's say, how the kinds of changes that you make to your shutter speed and your aperture or whatever else are going to affect the output image. And one key difference with respect to AI algorithms is that it seems that we do not have that kind of transparency with respect to how our choices will affect the output of the tool. And so that creates problems for thinking of it as a tool. On the other hand, appealing to it as a kind of collaborator is perhaps also problematic insofar as we often think of collaborators as individuals with their own agency and sensibility, and we would be forced to attribute something like this to an AI model if we were to think of it as a collaborator. And so these are real, I think, problems. They may not be the deepest problems, but they're worries for these kinds of comparisons. But for my purpose, I'm not interested in really settling which of these analogies is correct. I want to instead note what is common to them, which is that both of them, again, kind of take the role of AI to be one of facilitating a final output, which again is the overall focus of our concern. And this is a point of view that has been sort of echoed, I think, in a lot of writing about AI-generated art. Here's philosopher Claire Anscombe, who's one of the sort of leading philosophical lights in thinking about AI art. Her overall appraisal of the contribution of AI to artistic production, she writes, although AI agents are not themselves artistically creative, they can work iteratively without human intervention to non-accidentally generate the formal features of an image and thus contribute to the realization of some of the salient properties of a work. What has emerged is a picture where the interactions between AI and human agents are key to the realization of the artistic value of the kinds of work under discussion. What she's really focusing on here is the idea that AI has a role to play in generating significant features of an output of a product. And that, to that extent, that is why we should think of it as significant artistically. And so what I'm going to be interested in doing is thinking about whether this is the only way that we should think of AI artists as interacting with AI. And I'm going to introduce a slightly different model for thinking about the nature of artistic interaction with AI platforms. I'm going to call it the exploration model. And according to this model, artists primarily interact with generative AI not so much as a means of realizing a product or an output, but rather as a means of exploring and interrogating the way that the generative AI platform, and this is in scare quotes, sees and represents. And I'll kind of explain this in a lot more detail as we go. But the sort of upshot of this, just to kind of foreshadow a bit, is that I think that this will shift the sight of artistic appreciation away from the output and instead more towards the nature of the artist's interaction with the AI and the way in which the artist structures this interaction. And so, the products of this interaction, let's say like an image or something that results from the process, they're not going to be the primary object of appreciation, but rather they're going to function almost perhaps as a kind of documentation or evidence of the artist's exploration. I think that this connects with the way that lots of folks working in the space are thinking of what they're doing. Two contemporary AI art researchers, Eva Satinich and James Shea, writing about the artistic practice of AI artists, have said most of the current AI artworks can be understood as results of sampling the latent space. Perhaps the most novel aspect of AI art is this possibility to venture into that abstract multidimensional space of encoded image representations. How one orchestrates the design of this space and what one finds in it eventually becomes the major task and distinctive signature of the artist. And so what I think is centrally important about this characterization is that it's less focused on the output of the process, and it's more directed towards kind of creating a space for almost interaction, mapping and exploration. And AI art involves kind of making this meaningful or significant. And to say why this is important, I'm actually going to appeal to a rather different and hopefully unexpected analogy. It's an analogy with performance art. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a fairly well-known piece in performance art. This is Marina Abramovich's Rhythm Zero. It's a piece from 1974. And I'll describe this to you a bit. It was initially performed in Naples in 1974. And the piece consists of a set of objects placed on a table. These range from flowers, wine, and bread to guns, blades, and construction tools. And the table also included a set of instructions provided to the audience. The audience was instructed to use the objects on the table, on Abramovich herself, in any way they desired. She claimed full responsibility herself for any outcome of the process in the 6 hours of the performance. And perhaps unsurprisingly, things got pretty bad, pretty quickly actually. By her own account, what began as mild interaction very soon turned to attempted humiliation and assault as the audience removed her clothes, marked her body, cut her, ultimately threatened her life. My goal isn't nuanced interpretation of Abramovich. There's plenty of that out there. But instead, what I want to draw attention to is her general approach to this kind of piece and other pieces of the sort. By structuring her interaction with her audience through the provided objects and instructions, she aimed to elicit particular sorts of participation from them. And it was the participation itself that would illuminate the sorts of issues that she was interested in, issues of collective responsibility, susceptibility to suggestion and instruction, perceived divisions between art and life, whatever else the piece is about. We sort of access that through the participation, which she structured by way of her instructions, the objects on the table, so on and so forth. And so my suggestion is that many AI artists are engaged in a kind of similar practice of creating a space for structured interaction with AI. And what's significant is the kind of, as it were, participation that is elicited. Note, of course, that participation here is in scare quotes. The exploration model faces some of the same concerns about attributing a sort of agency to AI as the production model, in particular thinking of AI as collaborators. So I'm aware of that as a concern. But the idea here is that by way of their prompts, AI artists elicit a sort of participation on the part of the AI. And this participation allows them to get to know the AI, to better interrogate the algorithm's latent space. And you might ask, why might it be significant to learn about the way that the algorithm, as it were, sees and represents the world, how it will respond to a particular prompt or to a set of images? Well, let's go back to what I was saying earlier in the technical primer. AI image generators are trained by way of deep learning algorithms applied to a massive corpus of image-text pairs sourced from the internet. And so what we are learning about when we learn about the algorithm's ways of seeing and representing, we are in some sense learning about our own ways of seeing and representing, at least insofar as these are expressed in the visual culture of the internet and encoded by the algorithm. We are seeing ourselves through a glass darkly. Or at least that is one of the things that might come out of this, right? We might be interested to learn how it is that, for example, we have come to represent and see, and we might learn about our visual culture by way of this process of interrogation. Let me give you a few examples just to make this more concrete. So I'll start with the work of Sofia Crespo, who is an artist using AI to interrogate our visual representation of the natural world. And this is a piece from her series Critically Extant from 2022. And it's a series of works in which she uses an AI image generator to create representations of endangered or extinct species. And what is, I think, interesting about this is that even though the image generators that she was making use of are trained on millions of publicly available images on the internet, the generated representations look basically nothing like the species themselves. So this image here is a picture of the Taurus gudgeon, a small freshwater fish native to Turkey, which the International Union for the Conservation of Nature lists as critically endangered. And Crespo's image of the fish looks very little like a fish at all, let alone this particular species of fish. And so what accounts for this near total absence of images and representations of these species in our ordinary online spaces is just the fact that we collectively fail to see these species, right? We do not have images or representations of them because we do not pay attention to them. The internet is chock full of pictures of very cute kittens and puppies, but is completely missing any sorts of images of many of these endangered species. And that points in some sense to, again, a sort of fact about us, and that can be interesting. Another example is the work of Mario Klingemann, who is a fairly, I think, a more well-known AI artist. And this is a work of his from 2018 titled Memories of Passersby. And this is a sculptural installation featuring portraits that are automatically generated by way of an algorithm that Klingemann himself coded. So Klingemann is actually well known for not just using, as it were, off-the-shelf image generators, but rather creating his own models, many of which involve corpuses of artworks that he himself has selected. And so this particular piece was trained on thousands of painted portraits from the 17th to the 19th centuries. And although each of the images that are kind of generated, you can see, they're sort of these paired portraits, and they kind of shift over time as new portraits are generated. Although each of the images that are generated are novel, they nevertheless bear an uncanny resemblance to a great many classic works of portraiture. And this is interesting insofar as it, I think, allows us to come to see and perhaps better understand some of the conventions associated with classical portraiture. It's kind of a way of looking at how traditionally we have represented or seen. A few further points of elaboration about the exploration model. So, as I have said, rather than being the main focus of artistic appreciation, the outputs, that is the AI-generated images, they serve instead as a kind of documentation of the artist's process of exploring interrogating and mapping the algorithm. Just to go back to the analogy with Abramovich, Tate Britain includes in its collection the table and the objects which Abramovich made use of in Rhythm Zero, as well as a series of photographs of the piece and other forms of documentation. But in an important sense, these aren't really the work, right? They are pieces that were used in it. Maybe they function as a way of acquainting us with it as individuals who come to learn about the work and to appreciate it later on. But the work itself is, in some sense, the kind of participation that Abramovich elicited. And this kind of takes us to the second point that I wanted to emphasize. What it is that the AI artist contributes, according to the exploration model, the work consists in establishing rules for the participation of the generative AI by way of their prompt. In an important sense, that is the work. And there's a fair amount of recent philosophy kind of emphasizing that in a lot of contemporary art, there's a great deal of significance not just on objects, but also on rules. Think here of things like a Solowit wall drawing that consists of a set of instructions for creating an image on a wall. This is not an unfamiliar thing in contemporary art. And yet I think that thinking of art making as establishing these sorts of rules, it maybe doesn't come quite as naturally to us in sort of our ordinary engagement. This is perhaps why the exploration model has been comparatively neglected. And so I think this is the sort of role of the AI artist, and the significance consists in this process of exploration. So I've introduced these two models, and I would now want to, being a philosopher, hedge a little bit and introduce some disclaimers. This is what we do. Two of them. So first, I want to point out that my goal here is not to say that here is the one way that you should be thinking of what it is that AI artists are doing. The production model and the exploration model are not meant to be exclusive. It seems to me that probably the majority of AI artists are engaged kind of in aspects of both of these models. So Sophia Crespo, for example, who I was presenting earlier, there's no doubt in my mind that she is kind of engaged with the visual appeal of the images that result from this process, and to some extent their weirdness. And yet I think solely to pay attention to that would be to miss out on something significant about her work. And I think that's true quite generally. And so my goal here is to try to expand what it is that we might focus on and pay attention to with respect to the activity of AI artists by introducing perhaps an additional lens that we can use. The other thing that I wanted to say is that, and again, this is something that I think we will see in many of the presentations later on, a lot of AI art departs from very simple applications of generative AI tools, which I've really only been focusing on the most basic application of sort of a prompt to an image generation platform. AI artists are doing all sorts of wild and crazy things that go well beyond this and depart in their practice from, they are incorporating AI into practices of calligraphy, painting, and sculpture. They're creating robots that are generative in their own rights, which we'll hear about later. And so, I think that, again, I don't mean to give an indication that this is the only way to do AI art. But I wanted to, by limiting myself in this way, to really try to point out that there is still a kind of possibility of genuine artistic agency and meaningful artistic production, even at the level of simply entering prompts into an image generator. So, let's see how I'm doing time-wise. So, I will end with a few implications of the view. Basically, my thought here is that which of these aspects of AI art we emphasize is going to lead us to really different answers to a number of important questions downstream concerning the understanding, appreciation, and evaluation of AI art. And I'm going to talk about 3 of these issues. I'm going to do so rather quickly, and perhaps we can talk a bit more about them in the discussion following. So let's start with the topic of style in AI art. And is there such a thing as an artistic style in AI art? And what might it consist in? The first thing I want to do is distinguish between general and individual style. A general style would be a set of distinctive characteristics or notable features common to a body of work. Think here of like the characteristic features of Art Nouveau or Brutalism, or Impressionism or things like that. Whereas individual style would be something like the characteristic mode of agency present in the work of an individual artist, a particular choice of technique, a specific set of artistic resources, and so on, which perhaps express something like the artist's ideals for their work or something central to the artists themselves. And so I think that adopting something like the production model, where our focus is on the outputs, might push us to look for something like a general style in the outputs of AI art. The images and other artifacts that are generated by way of generative AI platforms. And some people have said, like, if there is a unifying style, it is weirdness. Think here of AI hands, which I'm sorry, I've inflicted this upon you. This image of AI depictions of fingers and hands, and other sorts of ways in which AI sort of fails, garbled text, impossible geometries and architecture and things like that. Some folks have said that this kind of weirdness is what is most characteristic of AI as a style. But notice that what we are focusing on here is commonalities among the outputs of the image. And it's also worth noting that this is perhaps something transitory. It will go away as AI gets better at creating convincing images. But notice if we shift to something more like the exploration model, where we would be looking for artistic style would not be at the level of outputs. Rather, it would be at the level of the kinds of choices that are being made by the artist. We would be looking, perhaps at, how an artist is going to choose their prompts, what kinds of topics they might be looking to interrogate, what areas of the algorithm they might be looking to map out. And this is not going to be something necessarily discernible at the level of the outputs. Style becomes less something, visual, something that you can perceive, more something conceptual, something that you have to kind of understand more about the context of the choices the artist is making. And so again, adopting either one of these models is going to direct us to look in very different places if we're concerned with trying to think about, let's say, like what's significant about a body of work, the work of an individual AI artist, something along those lines. Another topic, which I think folks have, this came up a bit in James's remarks at the beginning. There's a worry about algorithmic bias in AI generally. It should hopefully be pretty well known that at this point AI tools, which are trained on very large data sets, take on biases that are inherent in those data sets. This is something which has been sort of proven without correction. Lots of AI tools reproduce biases similar to very many well-known implicit bias patterns in humans, biases with respect to race, sex, and age. This is usually taken to be a kind of ethical or political concern, that in using these tools, we ought to have sort of ethical worries. But there's actually an additional aesthetic worry, which is that in the case of image generation, maybe these platforms will merely reproduce established modes of representation. They won't be capable of creating anything new, and to that extent, artists who make use of them will be locked in to existing modes of representation. They won't, again, be able to create anything new because anything that they create will be largely an echo of past styles, and to that extent, there won't be anything aesthetically significant or interesting. And so this is a concern that I think a lot of folks have had, and what I want to note is that which model that we employ is going to shape how we would respond to this concern. Suppose that we default to something like the production model. Well, what we would need to do is say, well, hey, no, look, you can actually use AI image generators to create images that aren't locked in to established modes of representation. What we'd be focusing on here would be the goal to kind of create novelty visually in the outputs. And in fact, you can create some really weird stuff. You can make AI it can produce, you can train an algorithm to generate something that looks maximally unlike other things it has been trained on while still being recognizable as art. And you can create some things that look very new and interesting. But notice that response depends on you thinking that what matters here, at least in terms of artistic creativity and novelty, is creating something that looks different, something that is a new mode of representation, let's say. But notice that adopting something like the exploration model might instead encourage us to think about these kinds of biases as potential artistic resources rather than limitations. They become the material that an artist may want to explore or interrogate as part of their artistic practice. And so it seems to open up the possibility for a kind of creativity on the part of the human AI artist insofar as what they're actually engaged in is questioning and responding and mapping out those biases. A final point, and this is, again, I think a thing that will come up quite a bit in our discussions, has to do with issues of copyright and credit. So let's circle back to the case of Jason Allen that we began with, and just an update on this. So in September 2023, after more than a year of requests and appeals, the US Copyright Office's Copyright Review Board denied Allen's request for copyright of the image that he had submitted to the Colorado State Fair. They concluded that the work, which largely consists of the image, was for the most part generated by the AI image generation tool Midjourney, and that Allen was not himself responsible enough for the traditional elements of authorship of the work. And this reflects the office's current policy for AI art, that they will only allow copyright of art created with AI if enough of the so-called traditional elements of authorship are created by a human. And I'm not going to try to resolve whether the US Copyright Office's policy is the correct one. Instead, I simply want to point out that its focus on the contribution of generative AI to the final product is squarely in line with the production model. Again, the sorts of questions that we would end up focusing on here would be ones about who is responsible for the output. To what degree is AI responsible for the output versus the human artist? And that's going to matter when it comes to questions of assigning credit, and also to policy issues like those of copyright and copyright protection. And so, developing this sort of policy is really going to depend on our conception of what the artist is doing, and then also what the artwork ultimately is and what it consists in. The exploration model might encourage us to focus not so much on the outputs again, but rather on something like the artist's prompts or other aspects of the artistic process as the work itself and as something subject to credit and copyright protection. And intriguingly, this is actually something the US Copyright Office has already considered, allowing in its guidance on AI authorship that some prompts might be, quote, sufficiently creative to be protected by copyright themselves. And so notice that that's a real shift, though, from what it is, what the work is, and what ought to be protected from the output to something more like the prompts and the process that goes into it. So just to kind of conclude, I want to conclude with some more general musings about how we understand emerging artistic practices. I think that it's inevitable that when we're confronted with a new artistic medium, we try to make use of comparisons with established media to understand it. And this is something that we've done since time immemorial. We tried to understand photography by comparison to painting. We tried to understand the novel by comparison to verse, and this goes back. And so I think it's inevitable. I think some people say, no, you should always try to just sort of understand something on its own terms. I don't think we really have a choice in the matter. But what I want to emphasize is that the comparisons that we make matter, and they matter tremendously for how we come to understand the emerging media. And I think the default comparison that we sort of resort to is with photography, film, other production-oriented practices, where largely the goal is to realize something, and then the thing that we look at and experience, that is the thing that we appreciate. That is the work itself. And we rely on tools or collaborators or other means of realizing it, but what we ought to pay attention to fundamentally is the output. But what I hope to have done is opened up perhaps a new comparison. There are other comparisons we could appeal to with, for example, forms of contemporary art, in which the work seems not to be so much about realizing some output, but rather about creating a space for interaction and participation. And I think my hope is that we can better understand the work of AI artists, understand what's significant about it, what's important about it, what it is, by appeal to comparisons with these forms of art as well. So I hope I've opened up this kind of new mode of understanding and appreciation. And that is where I'll end it. I'm looking forward to conversation on this. Thank you all so much.
Anthony, thank you so much. That was truly masterful. Such an incredibly concise and erudite talk. Thank you so much. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. Does anyone want to kick us off? Yes. If you go first, and then Michael after you.
And I'll hand you the mic, but please just state your name for the first day so that we can get that. Thanks.
Hi, my name's Sarah. My question, I guess, is in proposing another analogy. I was really interested when you brought up the idea of opacity and the fact that we can't really see these neural networks and the kind of processes of iteration necessarily that AI is doing when we give it a prompt. But I'm wondering, to what extent do you think that's related to the ways in which, as artists, even if I'm working with my hand, I'm drawing in the traditional sense, I can't access my nerves going back and forth between my brain, and I have all kinds of kind of implicit choices and biases and things that I'm making without even necessarily being consciously aware. And do you think there's a way in which that's analogous to how we input to AI?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, and I didn't. So it's also the case that, for example, when we rely on collaborators, they are opaque to us in the way that other minds are opaque to us, in that we don't know exactly what they are going to do as a result of our instructions or our choices. So I didn't mean to indicate that opacity is we should hope for complete transparency with respect to our dealings with AI, or for that matter, with respect to our dealings with our own artistic choices in practice. I had only meant to introduce that as, it seems like that is that form of transparency is something that we might value, however, in a tool that we're making use of. Right? We might want to know precisely how, altering, let's say we're talking here about photography, altering choices about your aperture, shutter speed, what that effect that will create. That matters to us because, in a sense, we're trying to achieve a very particular kind of output. And so it might seem like that would be a valuable quality. But you're right. I mean, there are, I think, modes of artistic production in which opacity is ineliminable, and that's maybe not a terrible thing.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Michael.
Thank you for that talk. That was really fascinating. Michael Tippett. I try to make AI films. It's not easy. Sometimes I sort of succeed. Most of the time, I just generate really weird stuff. And I spent a lot of time in Midjourney, and I remember the first time I really kind of sunk my teeth into it and just spent 6 hours spinning up images, which you can actually do without even realizing you spent 6 hours doing it, is I came out of that and I felt like instead of creating art, I felt like I just walked through the world's largest art gallery. And so for me, another analogy would be the gallery as a technology, right? Or even a book. It's like you're being surprised about what's around the next corner. And so if you want to understand the exploration model, I think the best thing to do is just play with Midjourney for 5 hours, and you'll experience that. You really will. It's a physical thing you'll experience.
Yeah, one of the early there was a sort of early community of users of Midjourney, and they created an online forum for themselves where they could discuss their results and share, and they referred to themselves as the latent space astronauts.
Right.
They were like voyaging into this new terrain and just coming back and bringing the things that they had found. And I think that experience of just kind of wandering through a gallery or a world and trying to kind of explore it and map it is, it is, especially if you have played or used these tools. I think that's very close at hand when we make use of them. That was part of what I was trying to kind of capture, is the sense of that sort of exploration. Also, to give a sense of why that might be significant. We have to think about the fact that the reason why it is so significant is that these are platforms that have been trained, in a sense, on existing visual culture, on the history of art and the history of painting, and it renders it, accessible to us in a way that, perhaps it might not have been previously. It also allows us to kind of interrogate some of the biases that might be inherent in it, to better understand some of the gaps in that visual culture. And I think that is what I wanted to highlight, is that it gives us these tools for exploration that we might not have had before.
I think we have a question from Dominic and then from Unju.
Good. Yeah, I'm Dominic. Thanks. So, thanks, Anthony. I have a small concern, but if you take it on board, it just requires a tweak. So, you emphasize that the production model and the exploration model illuminate complementary aspects of some AI-based art, as we know it these days, some practices that we're familiar with. And at the end, you were suggesting that it's important not to put too much weight on comparing AI art to image art. So my concern is, I'm not persuaded that it's not also the case that the production model and the exploration model illuminate complementary aspects of all artistic production from the beginning of time. So when you look at a painting, you're interested in the final product, but you're also interested in the clues it gives to you as to the process of its making. And it's just full of those kinds of clues, and that's very important. That's part of the appreciation. That's part of the achievement of the artist that we glean from the work. That's process. In fact, it's algorithmic. If an algorithm is just a process, it's a procedure for making, then you have algorithms in both cases. So would you accept that, or do you think that there really is something new in AI art in that it is balancing? It's dividing our focus between production and process in a way that early art just didn't do.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, to go to the analogy of earlier art of things like painting, right? The site of appreciation remains the painting itself, right? That is. And so we look to that for sort of clues, but that is the work, right? And to the extent that process is significant or important, it is significant insofar as it gives us clues as to the achievement of creating the output, right? And so I would say, like, what's interesting in this case is that, and perhaps what might lead us away from that comparison, is that with AI art, at least part of what the work is or what might be significant is just not there. And so it does seem like there might be a kind of fundamental bifurcation here, where the thing that we really ought to be paying attention to is more like the creation of a space to elicit participation, a set of rules or things like that. I don't know. I mean, there might be some folks who would want to say that there are, you could understand things like traditional painting as a set of rules for looking at an image, and so you could build out the model to make it more like that. I wouldn't be against that. I don't know if that addressed.
Very quickly. So I'm thinking about Valheim.
Yeah, okay.
For Valheim, the painted object in front of you is an instrument. It's a set of clues to understanding what was going on with the artist as the artist made the painting. And so he really doesn't think that the object of appreciation is principally the painting itself. It's the work of making the painting.
I see. Yeah, so maybe AI art is just drawing our attention to something that we didn't realize about traditional artistic media, although I think that would be highly revisionary to how most people think about painting.
This is what happens when you put two great philosophers in a room together. We have Unju, and then we've got Kate, and then we've got Charu.
So thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. And I just like from the very practical perspectives of either artist or arts manager, I think that this kind of conversation was very helpful for me to do to run the programs and be aware of what AI can do and how we can ensure the copyright and other issues that we all talk about. So because I'm from the London Arts Council and I, through the purchase of service agreement with the City of London, we do have a community arts investment program and the public art and monument program that we always manage and administer. And recently, in our conversation with the many different arts funders, we've been talking about how can we actually ensure artist application is completely, I guess, pure. Can we make sure that it is not AI generated? And there were some different conversation about it, and then some people will say, like, well, we should know or encourage artists to utilize it to better prepare themselves. On the other hand, no, we don't know the implications of it yet, so we shouldn't really just jump on it. So in our perspectives, it's been kind of struggle because we do a lot of now digital work. So for example, traffic signal and rap projects, artists will apply or with submissions with many different images that they worked on. There's no way we can figure it out if it was AI generated or not. And if it is AI generated, is it allowed or not allowed? So right now, like I guess your presentation gave me some kind of alignment in what can we assure in our application like process, and how can we, I guess, include the AI artists in the process, but making sure very specific guidelines what will be acceptable as creative work, artworks, for the purpose of public art program and arts funding programs. But still, like I would like to kind of know your perspectives on that, like in terms of application process, like a public art, especially the images, like the example that you showed the first time, there are many artists who do not get the opportunities, but how can we ensure the artist's creativity process is still ensured through our process, but also opening up different methods so that artists are aware of the directions that our future, we are all going towards, right? Like, so what are the suggestions? This is a very practical side. I know that is my job that I need to figure it out, but I'm asking your opinion.
I appreciate the question, thank you, and also the practical concern. I mean, I think these are the sorts of things that are definitely downstream from what I've been focusing on here, and so I don't know that I have a really good, clear piece of advice for you. It seems to me that, there are questions about whether this stuff is art and whether it's worthy of our appreciation. And it seems to me the answer is like clearly yes. But then I think the really hard thing is how do we integrate this also with traditional practices, existing practices that don't incorporate AI? Do we create really hard and rigid categorization where we say that AI tools are or are not allowed? This is something that comes up also, in my context as an educator, with thinking about student work all the time. We're all sort of faced with this problem of what to do about the problem of not being able to tell whether or not something was the product of AI or not. And I don't have a good answer. Maybe this is something that we could all collectively discuss together. But I do think that often what goes along with that question is a sort of assumption that AI-generated work is less important or less useful or not a genuine expression of an artist's creativity insofar as it makes use of these tools. And that's something which I think is just false. That's something which I hope has come out in the context of the conversation here. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, sorry, I just would quickly like to add, I think you really gave kind of assurance in terms of artistic perspectives too, like a creative process that, how many ideas that artists have never were able to come out because of lack of time and lack of capacity that they have, right? But with the AI, all those seeds that they had inside of them will have a better chance to be actually produced and be appreciated not only by the artists, but so many other people. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
We have a question from Kate and Chara. Both of you, obviously working with art institutions, might have views on the dilemma that Anju is finding herself in.
Thank you. I'm Kate. I'm wild about this idea. I love it because basically, like, what I'm finding about the way you're articulating the exploration model, like, it makes really good sense to me because it's kind of like it's giving new kinds of words to something that's really familiar to me that I would describe in a different way, which is something like I'm looking at it through the lens of generative art practice, or for that matter, if on one hand there is a total, obsession or focus on the finished work, and that's your production model, and then you go if you go into giving words or to the process of creating something through algorithmic means, like in a generative artwork. I think historically, or in my mind, there's some kind of, not binary, but like some kind of sense I've made sense of it in the past as being like, you put a rule in place, obviously, as you've mentioned, and then the output is less important, as you've mentioned. But here, you're adding something which I think is articulating like the fact that in any kind of a generative art practice, or any kind of like practice that involves an algorithmic turn, the design, like where you locate the work, for me, has to do also with the design of let's say the algorithm or the process, or what you're asking the system to do in terms of a chance-based operation. You throw the dice and it comes back and that's your work. You can say that, and that's historically how people have looked at aleatory function. But there's something richer too, because you look at the work of, let's say, Sophia Crespo. It's the idea of these disappeared animals that gives meaning to the work as something that exists that you're looking at, but also as a concept of the work. And the same with Mario Klingman. He's instantiating a concept model, and that is what gives that's kind of what I would say the work is in general, which brings together both the output and the process of reaching into whatever the database or the concept. So I'm just trying to no conclusion really. It's just to say that this articulation is really raises a lot of questions for me and gives a lot of new language. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
No, I appreciate it. And I think, one of the things, again, to kind of emphasize about Klingeman's work and Crespo's work, the output does matter. And I think a large part of the sort of power and effectiveness of those works has to do with the fact that they do incorporate visually interesting imagery. It draws you in. But I think just to simply focus on that would be to miss out on something very important about what the work is and what's going on.
Yeah, totally.
Charo.
Charo. This is quite interesting to me because I'm a curator of contemporary art and I work mostly with living artists. My experience is that it's always the artists who are pushing technology and ideas forward. But I haven't really explored AI art in terms of including it in exhibitions or in my own research. So this is quite fascinating to me. I did, however, include one artist using AI in an exhibition, Natalie Pershevich. Do you know her? And this was an experiment for her. It was her only work that she'd ever used AI for. But she's of Japanese and European descent, and a lot of her work really explores hybridity and ideas of being native or non-native. So in terms of looking at species of plants, she uses a lot of plants in her work. So she did a video that was called AI Ikebana, and it was just a beautiful synthesis of all of these things that we're talking about, but like drawing attention to the fact that it was AI. And it was just like this kind of collage where it was you know ikebana. It's this traditional art of Japanese flower arranging. And so you could see in this video like this vase that was almost made of the flowers itself, and then it would kind of pop up and then it would morph into something else. It was almost like gooey-like or something. Then you'd start seeing the flowers in the vase, and it was just this loop. And I just thought, like, that's, to me, the way to use AI. I'm interested in seeing how other artists are doing it, but it was the critical kind of looking at it through her own practice and using it as a tool that I thought was so interesting.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, and I think there is a kind of continuity here with. So what you were saying about artists always kind of being at the forefront, pushing new technologies. I mean, one of the things that I think is interesting about a lot of AI art is that it's very much involved in our collective process of trying to understand AI. Artists have a role to play here by way of their kind of exploratory engagement with these technological platforms, by incorporating into their artistic practice. I do think, this is what's really interesting to me is the role that the arts have to play in trying to help us make sense of it.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yes. Christine.
Do we have?
Just speak.
Hi. Christine Wald. Thank you so much for your amazing talk this morning. I wanted to go back and ask for a point of clarification about Jason Allen and
Sure.
the copyright decision. Could you speak a little bit more about that and how that may impact future models of creation, whether they be exploratory or production?
Yeah, so thank you. I mean, the copyright questions around AI-generated art is like very live territory, and so I don't know if anything that I say here is going to be accurate or not at this point. But I think at least at present the policy, at least in the United States, and I'm not sure what it is in Canada or in Europe or other nations, but is that an AI image generator does not constitute a creative agent, and to that extent, it cannot be the work. What is generated by an AI image generation platform cannot be copyrighted. And so this is, in this sense, it's actually similar. There's like a famous case of like a squirrel that took a photograph of itself, and that was denied copyright because it was taken by the squirrel, which it was not a human agent who would be able to see copyright. And so I think at present, so then the question becomes, to what extent is the AI platform responsible for? So I use the phrase traditional elements of authorship. Which, according to the Copyright Office, would be things like, the main features, if it's an image, the main features of the image itself. To what extent do we assign a kind of credit? And they have given copyright, for example, to some cases where artists have made use of AI initially, but then done a significant amount of work themselves on an image, whether it be by changing the image or compositing it. Alan actually argued that he had played a large role because he had printed the image out like at his local Kinko's on like a big canvas sheet. He
to the fact that he would not divulge the prompt.
He wouldn't divulge the prompt, right?
That
he did
his IP, right?
Yeah, he did some light photoshopping as well, and so he claimed he was responsible. But again, I think the point of this is that I think the Copyright Office actually had said to him, if you want to try to copyright the prompt, you can, but you cannot copyright the image. And in that sense, it does seem like they kind of they seem to be much more oriented towards not so much the output, at least insofar as the output is the product of these systems, which they think are not human creative agents, but rather whatever it is that the artist is doing to elicit that response. I think the worry that Alan might have is that that's because I think he's oriented with the production model. That's just not the work or what's interesting or what matters, right? What matters is the really cool image that he was able to get, and that's what he really wants to copyright. But sort of what I'm hoping to say here is that maybe we should reorient our sense of what the work is, and so that might help us to better understand like what is it that actually ought to be subject to copyright protection. Hope that helped to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, I think that has broader implications for things like the art market and things like that. That's
absolutely
probably another conversation.
Totally, and Yeah, and I think there's huge unresolved space here that I think is kind of, again, sort of conceptually downstream, and the hope is that I'm just kind of I think I've made it more complicated rather than less, so apologies for that, but maybe we can make some progress on it. Yeah.
We'll just take 2 more questions and then we'll have a coffee. Michael and then Anthony.
Please remember to use the mic for follow-up questions.
So Michael and then Anthony and then a well-earned coffee break.
Yeah, I'll just keep mine very short here. But one observation about the copyright issue is that it's analogous to the way that software is copyrighted. So you can copyright code, so the actual lines of code, but you can't really copyright the outcome, right? So like a user experience or customer experience is something that is essentially, you can rip someone off and it doesn't matter. I had another question about safety. So obviously safety is a big issue with a lot of these generation tools, and there are many things you can't have it prompt or generate. And I'm wondering if you see that as a danger in terms of like policing sort of decency and what is acceptable expression and that sort of thing.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think one might think of that as, again, the limitation of the platform might itself become a kind of artistic resource to be interrogated or questioned, depending on whatever it is an artist is interested in. I could see it being a genuine limitation or being, as it were, fodder for more kind of creative engagement. One of the things, so an artist might choose to interrogate those limitations, or they might feel constrained by them. But I should also note that those are limitations that generally occur with off-the-shelf image generation algorithms. And so, the other thing to say here, the second of my disclaimers was that AI artists are doing lots of really cool stuff besides just using Midjourney, right? And so it's also possible that an artist might, recognizing this, choose to create their own version of the model, of the AI model, to interrogate whatever it is that they're interested in, that they're being restricted, out of concerns of safety. And maybe we actually think, it is probably a good thing that there are those safety restrictions for general consumer AI use. But in the same way that we think that artists might, that we ought to have a kind of space for artists to interrogate very difficult topics. We might think that the same thing is true with respect to AI artists. We might want to allow them to perhaps have a free space in which to interrogate the model without the sort of safeguards and guardrails. Thanks.
Anthony.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. It was really interesting. So I have a question about, so the 2 models are supposed to be models of what artists are doing with AI. And so I was wondering, what is the goal of the artist on each model, and how might that affect how we think of them as artists? So on the production model, the goal is a very intentional thing where there's a product or some feel they're going for or whatever. And on that model, it seems uncontroversial to still consider them an artist. But on the exploration model, I'm just wondering, what is the goal there? If the goal is purely just exploration and just to see, to understand how the model works, would we still consider the explorer an artist? And what's to distinguish that person with that goal from someone who, just is curious about AI in general?
Like an AI researcher.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a very good question, and I think to answer it, I would just say that I have a pretty liberal conception of what might constitute art making, such that I would want to include more exploratory modes of engagement as, and I think that this is something where lots of artists in more traditional media would think of what they're doing as, in some sense, exploring their medium. I don't think that this is revolutionary to suggest that artists might be engaged in the kind of process, but you're right. I mean, what that looks like may often be very similar to, what an AI researcher might be doing. And so again, I think that might just be what it looks like to be doing art in this domain. And this is true, I think, of many artistic forms that incorporate technology, right? You have to immerse yourself in the practices of working with your medium, whatever they may be. Whether it's Corten steel, you have to start casting, as we heard Karun discuss. You have to learn how to cast steel. If you're to work in this in the same way, it seems like if you're going to be an AI artist, you need to learn to code. You need to engage with models in this way. I think it's just you basically have to become an AI researcher.
Well, thank you, Anthony, so much. I mean, the number of questions you got, and we could have taken many more, is a testament to how fascinating your talk was. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Let's all give Anthony a round of applause.